1860 brought the American South to a choice that would determine the nation's future. 4 million enslaved people valued at between $2.7 and $3.7 billion. More than the combined worth of every railroad, factory, and bank in the United States. Cotton production had climbed past 2 billion pounds annually, representing 60% of all American exports and 75% of global supply. And the South wasn't economically backward or primitive, but generating wealth at a scale that made slavery seem economically unassailable. More millionaires per capita lived in the Mississippi River Valley than anywhere else in the nation. Return on investment in enslaved labor ranged from 10 to 15% annually, matching or exceeding returns on northern industrial capital. Per capita income in the South stood at 80% of northern levels, and New Orleans ranked as the wealthiest city per capita in America. These weren't the economic indicators of a dying institution kept alive by stubborn racism, but the numbers of the most profitable agricultural system in the world. The economic calculation facing both North and South turned brutal. Buying out all enslaved people would cost at minimum $2.7 billion spread over decades, requiring the federal government to triple annual spending just to make the payments. And the North refused to compensate slaveholders for what abolitionists saw as stolen labor and stolen lives, while the South refused to accept compensation and abandon a system generating unprecedented profits. War cost more than a buyout, but no political mechanism existed to achieve a buyout when neither side would accept the terms. Now, this video covers how slavery became the economic engine of American prosperity, why the system generated such extraordinary profits that it seemed economically inevitable, and why the Civil War was ultimately about whether economic calculations would determine moral questions. The argument isn't that slavery was economically efficient in any just or defensible sense, but that slavery was extraordinarily profitable for slaveholders, which made it politically and militarily difficult to destroy. And that difficulty is what nearly tore the nation apart. 1619 saw slavery in British North America begin when the first Africans arrived in Virginia, sold to colonists who initially relied on indentured servants from Europe to work tobacco plantations. Those indentured servants worked for a set period, usually 4 to 7 years before gaining freedom. But by the 1680s, the supply of European indentured labor was declining as economic conditions in Britain improved and fewer people needed to sell their labor for passage to America. Slavery filled that labor gap and became institutionalized across all 13 colonies by the end of the 17th century. Virginia and Maryland in the Chesapeake built economies on tobacco cultivation, which demanded large workforces during planting and harvest seasons, while the Carolina Low Country developed rice cultivation, which proved even more brutal since workers stood in flooded fields under sweltering heat for months at a time. Both crops generated enormous profits for plantation owners who could acquire and control unfree labor. The triangular trade emerged, connecting Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Manufactured goods like textiles, rum, and weapons flowed from Europe and New England to West Africa. Enslaved Africans crossed the Atlantic to the Americas under horrific conditions in what's known as the Middle Passage. And raw materials, including tobacco, rice, sugar, and eventually cotton, flowed back to Europe. Each leg of the triangle generated profits for merchants and ship owners, while plantation economies extracted wealth through forced labor. Slavery stood legal in all 13 colonies by the American Revolution, with the institution deeply embedded in both northern and southern economies. Northern merchants profited from the slave trade itself and from shipping southern products to market. Northern distilleries produced rum traded for enslaved people in Africa, and northern textile mills would later depend on southern cotton. After independence, northern states began gradual emancipation, while the South remained committed to the system. Tobacco had generated profits, but exhausted soil quickly, and suffered from price fluctuations that made plantation economics uncertain. By 1800, the tobacco economy was weakening in the Upper South as planters shifted toward wheat cultivation, requiring less labor. And the South needed a new cash crop that could sustain the slave system and generate the profits tobacco had once provided. The answer would transform American slavery from a primarily Chesapeake institution into a cotton kingdom spanning the Deep South. If this deep dive into the economic history of slavery is what you're here for, subscribe to The Economic History. We analyze civilization-scale economic systems like this. Next video, we're covering the economic history of the British Empire. 1793 brought Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin, a mechanical device separating cotton seeds from fiber, and the impact on American slavery cannot be overstated. Before the gin, this separation happened by hand and proved extraordinarily labor-intensive, with one worker able to clean about 1 pound of cotton per day. But Whitney's device could process 50 pounds per day, while larger versions powered by horses or water could process far more. Cotton processing went from being the bottleneck limiting production to being a solved problem. Explosive growth in cotton cultivation followed. Almost no cotton grew in the United States in 1787 when the Constitution was written. But by 1800, production had reached 156,000 bales, with each bale weighing between 400 and 500 pounds. 1835 saw production hit 500 million pounds, representing 55% of all U.S. exports. And by 1860, American cotton production exceeded 2 billion pounds annually, comprising over 60% of total American exports and representing about 75 to 80% of global cotton supply. British textile mills in Manchester and Liverpool demanded endless quantities of American cotton to feed the Industrial Revolution, while northern textile mills in New England also depended on southern cotton as their primary raw material. The global textile industry in both Britain and America rested on cotton picked and processed by enslaved labor, and profits flowed to plantation owners, merchants, bankers, and mill owners, while the people doing the actual work received nothing. The cotton gin didn't reduce the need for enslaved labor, as some optimistic observers predicted, but instead massively increased demand for enslaved workers because more cotton could be processed, which meant more cotton needed to be grown. The enslaved population grew from about 700,000 in 1790 to over 4 million by 1860. And the internal domestic slave trade became a major industry as enslaved people were sold from the Upper South, where tobacco was declining, to the Deep South, where cotton was king. Petit Gulf, a new cotton variety that was a hybrid of Mexican, Georgian, and Siamese strains, proved especially productive and moved west with slavery's expansion into new territories. Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana became the Cotton Kingdom, and by 1850 about 1.8 million of the nation's 3.2 million enslaved people were producing cotton, while by 1860 cotton dominated the Southern economy, absolutely with slavery as its foundation. And the two had become so intertwined that defending one meant defending the other. Cotton production per enslaved worker increased 600% in Mississippi between 1820 and 1860 through brutal intensification of labor. Plantation owners pushed workers longer hours, demanded higher daily quotas, and used violence to extract maximum productivity. And this wasn't just agriculture, but industrial-scale exploitation, using the most advanced accounting and management techniques of the era, applied to human beings treated as capital assets. American slavery in 1860 represented capitalism at its most profitable and most brutal. Enslaved people weren't just labor in the Southern economic system, but capital assets that could be bought, sold, mortgaged, and used as collateral for loans. Banks in New York and London provided financing to Southern planters who used enslaved people as security for loans. treating human beings exactly as they would treat land, buildings, or equipment. And an enslaved person became a line item on a balance sheet with an assessed value that could be leveraged for credit. $800 was the average price of an enslaved person in 1860, which equals roughly $25,000 in 2020 dollars when adjusted for inflation. A prime field hand, a healthy adult male in his 20s or 30s, could sell for up to $2,000 or about $60,000 in modern terms, while children, elderly people, and those with disabilities sold for less. And prices varied by region, with Deep South markets paying premium prices for workers who could handle cotton cultivation. Insurance companies sold policies on enslaved people's lives, protecting the owner's financial interest if the enslaved person died or was injured. This created perverse incentive structures where an owner could profit from an enslaved person's death by collecting insurance while suffering no economic loss. And the major insurance companies operating in the Antebellum South treated enslaved people as insurable property, just like ships, cargo, or buildings. The domestic slave trade became one of the largest forced internal migrations in American history. Between 1790 and 1860, over 1 million enslaved people were sold and relocated across state lines. And in each decade, between 1820 and 1860, approximately 200,000 people were sold and moved. Professional traders like Franklin and Armfield in Virginia operated sophisticated businesses buying enslaved people in the Upper South and selling them in the Deep South, where cotton cultivation demanded more labor. Auction blocks in cities like New Orleans, Charleston, and Richmond became financial markets where human beings were sold to the highest bidder. Enslaved people were inspected like livestock with their teeth examined, their muscles assessed, and their ability to work evaluated. While families were routinely separated when economic logic dictated selling individuals rather than keeping family units together. The emotional and psychological devastation of these separations simply didn't factor into economic calculations. Northern financial institutions profited directly from slavery, even though northern states had abolished the institution. New York banks financed southern plantations. Boston investors owned shares in cotton mills processing slave-grown cotton. And northern merchants handled shipment and sale of cotton to international markets, which meant slavery wasn't just a southern institution economically, but a national system with profits flowing to investors and businesses across the entire country, and to Britain and Europe as well. For decades, conventional wisdom among many historians claimed that slavery was economically inefficient and would have died out naturally without the Civil War. This argument suggested that free labor was more productive than slave labor, and that industrial capitalism would inevitably replace the slave system. But the evidence from careful economic analysis tells a completely different story. Robert Fogel and Stanley Engerman published Time on the Cross in 1974, using quantitative methods to analyze slavery's economic performance. Their research demonstrated that large slave plantations in the Antebellum South were economically efficient and highly profitable, generating returns on investment of 10 to 15% annually, which compared favorably to northern industrial investments. And the plantation system used sophisticated management techniques, including specialized division of labor, economies of scale, and careful monitoring of worker productivity. 600% growth in cotton production per enslaved person occurred in Mississippi between 1820 and 1860, not through technological innovation in tools or techniques, but through intensification of labor. Plantation owners lengthened working hours, raised daily quotas for cotton picking, and used violence and the threat of violence to push workers to their physical limits. While account books from plantations like Buena Vista in Louisiana show daily production averaging between 300 and 500 pounds per person, with weekly averages between 1,700 and 2,100 pounds. More millionaires per capita lived in the Mississippi River Valley than anywhere else in the United States by 1860. And this wealth came directly from cotton cultivation using enslaved labor. New Orleans ranked as the wealthiest city per capita in America, serving as the financial center where cotton was sold and shipped to mills in New England and Britain. And if the Confederacy had been a separate nation at the start of the Civil War, it would have ranked as the fourth richest country in the world based on total economic output. Per capita income in the South stood at about 80% of northern levels in 1860, which means the South wasn't economically backward compared to the industrializing North. The South was prosperous and growing, and its prosperity rested entirely on slavery, while the value of enslaved people as assets, estimated at $2.7 to $3.7 billion in 1860, exceeded the combined value of all railroads, factories, and banks in the United States. This made enslaved people one of the largest concentrations of capital in the American economy. Slavery wasn't dying in 1860, but expanding. Southern political leaders pushed aggressively to open new Western territories to slavery because cotton cultivation exhausted soil and planters needed fresh land. And the political conflicts over whether Kansas, Nebraska, and other territories would be free or slave states weren't abstract debates about principle, but fights over economic expansion. Slaveholders needed more land and more enslaved labor to continue generating the profits that had made the system so lucrative. Far from fading away, slavery in 1860 stood at peak profitability and peak political power. The argument that slavery would have ended peacefully through economic evolution is not supported by the evidence, since slavery was making too much money for too many people. And those people had every incentive to preserve and expand the system as long as they could. When Southern states began seceding in late 1860 and early 1861, the economic calculations were clear to everyone involved. The North held overwhelming advantages in population with about 22 million people, compared to the South's 9 million, of which 4 million were enslaved and obviously not available to fight for the Confederacy. And the North possessed vastly superior industrial capacity, more railroads, more factories, and better access to credit and financial resources. But the South had cotton, and Southern leaders believed that cotton gave them an unbeatable advantage. Cotton is king captured the Confederate strategy perfectly, since Britain's textile industry depended on American cotton, and Southerners assumed that economic necessity would force Britain to recognize Confederate independence and possibly intervene militarily to keep cotton flowing. The calculation proved wrong when Britain found alternative cotton sources in Egypt and India, and when British workers opposed slavery despite the economic costs. Peacefully ending slavery through a compensated emancipation scheme would have carried staggering economic costs. Economist Claudia Golden estimated that buying out all enslaved people in 1860 would cost about $2.7 billion at the time. And even spread over 25 years, the annual payments would require tripling federal government spending, which meant there was no political will in the North to pay slaveholders for what abolitionists viewed as stolen labor, and no willingness in the South to accept compensation and give up the system. The Civil War ended up costing far more than a buyout would have. Union government accumulated about $2.76 billion in debt financing the war effort. And dividing that by 4 million enslaved people yields about $690 per person, actually less than the average sale price of $800. But that calculation doesn't include Confederate costs, the economic destruction across the South, the loss of production during the war, and the 750,000 military and civilian deaths. Total economic cost of the war vastly exceeded what peaceful emancipation would have cost. But no mechanism existed to achieve peaceful emancipation when the two sides held completely incompatible positions The North increasingly viewed slavery as a moral abomination that had to end, while the South viewed slavery as essential to its economy and way of life. Slaveholders weren't going to voluntarily give up $3 billion in property. And Northern voters weren't going to tax themselves to compensate people who they believed had been committing injustice for generations. Economic logic alone couldn't resolve that conflict. Emancipation through the 13th Amendment in 1865 destroyed between $2.7 and $3.7 billion in Southern wealth overnight, making it the largest uncompensated seizure of private property in American history. From the slaveholders' perspective, this represented catastrophic financial loss. From the enslaved people's perspective, it meant finally receiving freedom that should never have been taken. And the economic and moral dimensions of slavery were inseparable, which is exactly why it took a war rather than market forces or political compromise to end the system. 1865 brought slavery's abolition not because it was economically inefficient, but because the North won the Civil War and imposed abolition on the defeated South. Southern agricultural output fell by about 1/3 between 1860 and 1880 after emancipation, and many economists initially interpreted this as proof that slavery had been economically productive. But the real story is more complex and more revealing about what slavery actually was. When enslaved people gained freedom, they made rational economic choices that had been impossible under slavery. Women and children left the fields, elderly people stopped working, and men gained more control over their labor through sharecropping arrangements that, while exploitative, were less demanding than gang labor under slavery. And the decline in output wasn't because slavery was efficient, but because slavery had been extracting labor through violence and coercion that free people would not voluntarily provide. Recent economic research by scholars like Richard Hornbeck and Trevon Logan argues that slavery was highly inefficient when you account for the costs imposed on enslaved people themselves. Enslaved people produced value but received almost nothing in return. And when you calculate the difference between what they would have needed to be paid to do that work freely versus what they actually received, emancipation generated economic gains equivalent to about 35% of 1860 GDP. Those gains went to the formerly enslaved people in the form of increased leisure, family time, and control over their own lives. Slavery proved profitable for slaveholders, devastating for enslaved people, and distorted the national economy in ways that persist to this day. Wealth gaps between Black and white Americans, regional economic differences between North and South, and the systems of sharecropping and debt peonage that replaced slavery in the decades after the Civil War all trace their origins to the antebellum slave system. And economic institutions have long-lasting effects that outlive the institutions themselves. The legacy of slavery extends far beyond economics into every aspect of American society. But understanding the economic mechanisms helps explain why slavery was so politically difficult to abolish. Enormous concentrated wealth and the political power that wealth provided kept slavery alive. Not just prejudice or tradition, and slaveholders controlled state governments across the South, held disproportionate power in the federal government through provisions like the 3/5 Compromise, and used that power to protect their economic interests. The lesson from America's experience with slavery is that the most profitable system isn't necessarily the most just, and that economic calculations alone cannot resolve moral questions. Slavery generated unprecedented wealth for slaveholders and for the American economy as a whole. But that wealth was stolen from millions of people who received nothing but suffering in return. And economics can make injustice seem inevitable or insurmountable. But moral and political choices ultimately override economic logic when enough people decide to make them. American slavery represented capitalism at its most efficient and most brutal. an economic engine that built a nation's prosperity on human suffering. War that killed 750,000 people and destroyed much of the South finally ended the system, not because economic forces made it obsolete, but because people decided that no amount of profit could justify the continuation of such an injustice. Subscribe to The Economic History for Civilization Scale Economic Analysis. Next video. The Economic History of the British Empire, how financial technology, not military might, built the largest empire in history.